Hi, welcome to Chavista Chronicles from Caracas. My name is Jesus Rodriguez. I'm the editor of Orinoco Tribune.com, and I welcome to this first video podcast that we're going to try to make it weekly. And we're going to try to make this a short video of 10 to 12 minutes, and in which we're going to try to highlight the most important, events that happened in Venezuela in the previous days. So this week we're going to talk about the Norway Talks, the decision of Maduro of not sending the delegation to Bahamas to continue the talks with the opposition. We're going to talk about the blockade or the recent U.S. sanctions against Venezuela that are the cause of Maduro's decision, one of the causes behind that decision by President Maduro. I want to talk about the economy a little bit, and I want to talk about Colombia as the most immediate threat to Venezuelan peace. So going back to the Norway talks, Maduro last Wednesday took the decision of not sending the delegation to Bahamas as a response to the executive order signed by President Trump last Tuesday, in which the U.S. basically frees all Venezuelan state assets in the U.S., but also because of a decision of a U.S. court a few days before that, seizing the CITGO in order to pay for the alleged debt that the Venezuelan government had with a Canadian gold company named Crystallex. So those two decisions are very important and are somehow the ones that provoked the decision of President Maduro of not sending the delegation to Bahamas. But it's important to highlight that the alternative to these negotiations is violence. So that's why it's very important from everyone that love Venezuela, that love the the Bolivarian Revolution and the Chavista movement to promote these dialogues. It's also important to give a little bit of background to these dialogues because these dialogues happen immediately after Guaido self-proclaimed himself. There was this initiative by Mexico, Uruguay, Bolivia, Caricom, and other countries around the world that promoted like a negotiation mechanism called the Montevideo mechanism, and that those countries pushed towards that direction at the beginning of this crisis in January, but immediately the U.S. blocked them, and because the U.S. always has been saying that the only negotiation possible is with Maduro out of office, which is no negotiation. So the radical position from the U.S. has been there always, even with these latest Norway talks. After several attempts of trying to keep this Montevideo mechanism afloat, the European Union gets somehow involved in that initiative, but not directly, but they propose also some sort of negotiations with something that is called the European Union Contact Group, which is like the same U.S. approach with a disguise, if you ask me, because they basically, they were not saying that there was no chance of negotiations, but they say that they were going to negotiate only if Maduro calls for elections. So that's the same approach of the U.S., but a little bit lighter. So those two approaches never happened. And then a few weeks later, Norway proposed these negotiations, and that's what has been happening in relation to this issue in recent weeks. So Maduro took this decision, but took this decision out of context. I mean, it's important to highlight that Maduro, since the beginning of his presidency, has been using a hard approach towards political attacks, political aggressions, political violence, like the assassination attempts, like the coup d'etat attempts, like the guarimbas, all that. And Maduro has been very active, putting in jail anyone that breaks the law. And I believe that that's the right approach in his case, because Chavez used a softer approach, but Chavez had way more charisma, a different kind of charisma than the Maduro one, and that was the only option that Maduro had to try to keep the country united. But in this particular crisis since January, Maduro has been using as the soft approach of Chavez, and that approach, if you ask me, was positive because it allowed to at least ease the attacks from mainstream media trying to portray him like a Caribbean dictator, tropical dictator, or something like that. But also because it allowed the revolution to identify traitors within the inner circle of Maduro, like this Manuel Figuera, the head of the intelligence, that right now is protected by the U.S., for example, and that supposedly is connected to the drone attacks of last year against Maduro. But also it allowed us to identify those officials that jumped to Colombia during the February humanitarian aid crisis in the border with Colombia. So it was helpful, but I believe that it got wasted because of all the negative impacts that U.S. sanctions were having on Venezuelan economy or on Venezuelan assets abroad. So that's why a few hours before a Maduro announcement of not sending the negotiators to Bahamas, there was an initiative, a Chavista-based initiative that positioned on Twitter the trend Guaido in jail immediately. That happened the day before Maduro made this latest announcement, and a few hours before Maduro's announcements, also the Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino, tweeted something that is very important, in which he basically demanded the stop of impunity in face of the U.S. blockade. So if you ask me, I believe that those are the two elements that somehow push President Maduro to take a more radical decision of stopping sending the negotiators to Bahamas. But I believe that's not going to be the only decision. Actually, when he made the announcement, he said that decisions were going to be taken in regarding to those politicians that have break the law. And if you ask me, I believe that means that Guaido might be in jail soon. So we have to be prepared for that. But I believe that's the right move, because I mean the Chavista base and the military and the facts are showing that the soft approach is already wasted, and that we need to take like a different approach toward the traitors like Guaido, that uploaded immediately the latest executive order signed by President Trump in Washington. So that's basically what happened in terms of this these negotiation talks in Norway Talks. But it's also important to highlight that the blockades in general are not something that help the U.S. foreign policy or U.S. interests. And we have the cases of Iran, Syria, Cuba, North Korea. I mean, those countries have been blockaded or sanctioned for several decades, and they have not represented a victory for U.S. policy. In the contrary, they represent a defeat, because they are resisting the U.S. attacks for decades. And some of them have been creating their own infrastructure, improving their economy. And that's, if you ask me, is what I want for Venezuela. I mean, this blockade, these latest attacks against Venezuela should transform into allowing Venezuela to be more independent, to somehow stop depending that much on imports, and at the same time, those attacks make the Chavista spirit get higher because of, I don't know, several elements. But if you ask me, I believe that it's a mix of nationalism with anti-imperialism. And whenever it's evident that the U.S. is attacking us, the Chavistas get more united, more supportive of, in this case, Maduro. So I mean, that's what happened with the blockade, if you ask me, against Venezuela. Now I'm going to talk briefly about the economy. In recent days, the devaluation in Venezuela has been going crazy. The bolivar was devalued in more than 100%. It was like 7,000 bolivars per dollar 2 weeks ago, and right now is, I believe, close to 14,000 bolivars per dollar. That's 100% in less than 2 weeks. So the inflation has not been touched yet by this latest evaluation, but I believe that in next days we're going to see prices going up like crazy, and that's bad because it is already hard for Venezuelans, for regular Venezuelans, to make a living, to survive with this crazy hyperinflation and devaluation that we have, economic crisis in general that we have in Venezuela. So this forced me to talk about the restrictive monetary policy implemented by the central bank and the government in recent months, especially since August 2018. And that policy has been putting a lot of weight on the working class shoulders. I mean, for example, the salaries are not being adjusted as they used to be because the central bank do not want too much money circulating in the economy in order to, according to the theory, stop or reduce the pressure on prices and the pressure on the dollar, on the devaluation. But the reality shows that at least in terms of the devaluation, that approach is not helping. But have to be acknowledged that in terms of hyperinflation, the prices have been controlled in recent months, and that's good. But of course, it's important to say that prices in dollars, because this policy has flexibilized the exchange rate control that we have before, and now people can use dollar and you can buy or sell dollars in banks or in different places in Venezuela. But somehow that has brought a de facto dollarization of Venezuelan economy, and a phenomenon that some people here call inflation in dollars, which is not true because, I mean, that couldn't happen. I mean, different than the U.S. inflation. But the way I see it is like it is just like an adjustment in the prices of certain goods and services that were extremely cheap a few years ago, and right now are being adjusted because the flexibilization in the exchange rate market, in the foreign currency policy. So just to give you an example, a household of 4 people could survive in Venezuela in 2017 with $200. Currently, that same household might need like $400 in order to make a living. So it's just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So the economic policy has been positive in terms of inflation, but has put a lot of pressure on the shoulders of the regular Venezuelans that do not have access to dollars. And those Venezuelans survive thanks to the CLAP program, which is marvelous because it delivers 6 million, boxes of food to more than 6 million households every month all over Venezuela. And that's why that program has been attacked. Actually, the previous sanctions against Venezuela before this latest from Tuesday were connected to actors or entities that help importing food that goes to the club programs that do not rely 100% on imports. I believe that, according to what I've seen, relies like in 30% or 40% on imports, but those imports are important in order to, keep the program alive and with the variety of items that are needed by a household. So that's the situation. And now, just to finish, I want to talk a little bit about Colombia. Colombia is the biggest threat to Venezuela in a scenario in which the negotiations are not an option. I mean, without the negotiations, the option is violence. And in that scenario of violence, Colombia is the first risk. The second risk is a civil war, if you ask me, which I don't see it very clear. And the third risk is a U.S. military operation or some kind of U.S. military intervention in Venezuela, which also I don't see it very clear. But using Colombia as a proxy with the paramilitary elements and even the Colombia army to try to create some sort of war between Colombia and Venezuela is a big possibility, which, if you ask me, I believe is not going to play well for the Colombians. But anyway, I mean, we have to, in that sense, we have to say that in Colombia in recent months, more than 700 social leaders have been killed, most of them connected to FARC or to the guerrilla movement. And that happened after the signing of the peace agreements a couple of years ago. And those agreements were promoted heavily by Venezuela, by Chavez and Maduro especially. And it's a shame that the Colombian oligarchy has not learned the lesson of history and keep pushing into violence. And our compass in Colombia called it a genocide. I mean, they are killing social leaders, and that eventually is going to bring violence and the guerrilla movement back on track in Colombia, which is a shame, if you ask me. But of course, that represents an opportunity in the case of Venezuela, because that guerrilla is sympathetic to the Bolivarian revolution. So it's something that the Colombian elite should be pay attention to, because that might represent a problem for them. So that paramilitary, those killings are committed by paramilitary forces mostly, and those paramilitary have permeated to Venezuela. They are already in Venezuela. They are content somehow, but it's important to highlight that a few days ago, 6 peasants, Chavista peasants in Barinas State, in Ticoporo, Barinas State, were killed by paramilitary forces, and that trend is dangerous, and the Venezuelan government has implemented security measures in the border after that, but that's something very hard to stop, because the border between Venezuela and Colombia is humongous. So that's a problem that we have, and we have also the problems of migration between Colombia and Venezuela, and because of this economic crisis that we in Venezuela are facing, there are a lot of Venezuelans, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans that are emigrating to South America, and some of them use Colombia like a transit, like in transit to the south of the continent. But some of them also remains in Colombia, and that represents a problem for Colombia, especially because they are promoting recently, not only in Colombia, but in other countries in Latin America, xenophobia against Venezuelans. But because of this recent genocide that is being promoted by paramilitary forces in Colombia, there's a new trend of Colombian migration to Venezuela, escaping from the paramilitary violence. So that's something that has to, take into account. So this is basically what we wanted to present you this week. I believe that it's taken longer than usual, but it's the first one. We're going to try to keep the next one shorter. And we thank you again for letting us present you our perspective about what happened in Venezuela. We thank you for following us and reading us and helping us being ranked right now very good in terms of internet rankings. And we believe that by the end of this year, we are going to be close to websites like Venezuela Analysis or Visión Verdad, which are, if you ask me, the most important progressive news outlets in English about Venezuela around there. So, and we just in just 8 months have been able to be close to what they have built in more than 5 years. So we are happy because of that. We rely on you to make us like stronger and to help us spreading the word about Orinoco Tribune. Bye bye, un abrazo fuerte from Caracas. Take care.